think we are good to go.
Okay, so we are redirecting to Facebook Live.
Have you been going into the office much? The Time War Center?
No, I think we're live. So this is my office these days. Good evening, everybody. My name is Catherine Maggie Oliver. I'm with the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War at Shepherd University. Some of you may also know me for my cocktail programs for the Harpers Ferry Park Association, one of our co-hosts this evening. Tonight, I'm also very excited to be joined by Joe Rizzo of Loudoun Museum. Welcome, Joe. So what we're going to do tonight, again, welcome to Virtual Vintage Happy Hour. We're going to talk about a classic American cocktail here on what should be Kentucky Derby weekend. We're going to be honoring the Mint Julep and the man who brought it to us, Henry Clay of Kentucky. So before we get started, let me just review if you want to make one home, follow along with us. You are going to need, for some mint julep, you will need, obviously, some mint. I have some fresh mint, fresh out of my garden that I'll be using this evening. You are going to need a sweetener. In modern language, we would say that we need a simple syrup. This is mine, which is actually naturally zero sugar. I'm not quite sure what that means, but we'll find out tonight how that works. If you don't have a simple syrup at home, the great thing about a classic 19th century cocktail is that it is absolutely historically accurate to improvise. So feel free to grab whatever sweetener you prefer, whether it's something like honey or another syrup. I even heard of people using maple syrup, which will definitely be a different taste for you, but feel free to use what you prefer. What I will caution you though is if you're using something like honey that is a little thicker, you'll want to stir that into the alcohol first before adding the ice, because that will, honey and ice do not mix well, and you will end up with just chunks of honey in your drink. Maybe you'll like that, I don't know. Like I said, it's time to improvise, time to improvise on Friday evening while we're all at home. The last thing you will need, obviously, is some bourbon. I have some Kentucky Woodford Reserve bourbon that I'll be using this evening for my mint julep. And I lied, there's one more thing you're obviously going to need, and that's a little bit of ice. Supplies, you're going to want an empty glass and something to stir with and also press the mint around with. Traditionally, we'd be using something like a muddler, which is often made out of wood. My muddler is a bamboo lunch knife this evening. Other things you might be able to use is a small spatula, either the handle end or the spatula end. Again, improvising is absolutely historically accurate. So the mint julep is a very, very old drink. And though I said that we're going to be honoring Henry Clay for bringing it to us in the mint julep form, tying it to Kentucky, it's actually much, much older than that. This is a concoction that some people say goes back perhaps several hundred years, perhaps almost 1,000 years old. And there are many different variations of the alcohol used and also the sweeteners used. So I can't get over the word improvise here. But Henry Clay introduces us to this at large in the year 1830. And at that time, he is living in Washington, D.C. And he goes to what will become the famous Willard Hotel and tells them how to mix this drink. So let's get started with that. Okay. Let's see here. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to, sorry, lost my page here. The first thing we're going to do, according to Henry Clay, we're going to take our mint leaves, fresh and tender. So if you pull, I literally have a mint plant.
You got those from your garden, right?
Yes, these are from Sunny Meadows near the Antietam battlefield. I'm not sure how they feel about me using their product to make bourbon drinks, but I'm very grateful to them. So the mint is straight out of what's been going on in my spring garden here. And you get a little sprig like this. Traditionally, you would be serving this in a coin silver goblet. We don't have that. They're very hard to find. I do have one, but I thought I'd play along with this game of what can we find in our kitchens. So you're going to take your mint leaves, and you can either choose to leave them like this, or you can actually pull them off if you prefer. One tendency people have is to you want to smush them up. We're not actually going to smush them up. You want to lay them in your glass like so, and then you would take your muddler and you're going to bruise them kind of against the side. So I'm basically just pressing them against the side of the glass. This is what they call bruising them. We don't want to break the leaves up. We don't want to tear them or anything like that. Just sort of lightly release the oils. You can start to smell. We don't have smell vision on Zoom, but it smells very nice. The next thing we're going to do, according to Henry Clay, we're going to fill our goblet about halfway with ice. So I got that. So then we are going to take our bourbon and just a little, as Henry says, mellow bourbon aged in oaken barrels, poured from the glass and allowed to slide slowly through the ice. So it's a very slow drink, filling that up. The next thing we're going to do is with our second cup. We are going to, according to Henry, you would mix some sugar into freshly chilled limestone water, which is something that you might have gone outside and gathered. If you haven't gathered any water dripping off limestone today, instead what we'll use is, instead of mixing limestone water with sugar, we're going to use our simple syrup instead. And this we just sort of mix in as well. So basically your ratio should be half a glass about full of ice. If you're using measurements, a bar measurement, a jigger of bourbon, and then you add your sweetener really just to taste. And there's your julep. You can add more mint if you like to sort of decorate the glass around it for a garnish. This isn't the best view here. And there we have our lovely mint julep. So as I said, this is something that is created by Henry Clay back in the year 1830 while he is in Washington, D.C. Henry Clay is a Virginian by birth and by training. But how did he get to Washington, Joe? What is he doing in Washington, hanging out at the Willard Hotel?
Yeah, and thanks for having me first and foremost. And for Henry Clay, he's a fascinating figure, both with his political career, but also his personal life. He's someone who dominates the congressional scene for decades. And he's a charismatic figure, and personally, people want to be around him. Professionally, they gravitate toward him and his really enthusiastic and electric style of speaking, and really just the way in which he conducts himself. And he's someone who's bouncing around pretty frequently, like people do. He's in Washington, D.C. once he starts getting elected pretty early on in his life. But he often goes back to Kentucky where he's got a farm. He grows hemp. He's got other activities and a law practice that he picks up off and on while he's in Kentucky. But you're right, he's born in Virginia. He spends his youth in Richmond. He tries to pretend like he's a common, poorish kind of person in his childhood. Not exactly accurate, but it plays pretty well politically. But like a lot of Virginians do, they realize that the West offered some real potential. And that's why just before 1800, he moves to Lexington, Kentucky, where his mother and his stepfather were, and he starts a law office. But it's not long before he's in Lexington that he gives very passionate speeches. It starts when they start looking at the Kentucky Constitution, and he gets a name for himself pretty quickly, and at a pretty early age then gets elected to the US Congress. And from there, at various points, he'll serve in cabinet positions. He'll be in Congress, he'll be in the Senate. He's got a lot of attempts to try to become president, but never quite can finally get the presidency, which was a lifetime goal of his.
Wow, so he's actually running for the presidency a number of times. What were some of his what were some of his goals as president? What was he running on? What was his platform?
Well, there's a few things that really drive Henry Clay, and he is someone who is willing to change his mind over time. But there's a few things that he really keeps throughout his career. One of those was, it's kind of a surprising thing, is that he is anti-slavery. And that surprises people because he is a slave owner in Kentucky. He's a slave owner for his entire life. But he's someone who starts his career early on in Kentucky trying to get the state to adopt gradual emancipation. And he will fight against the institution of slavery for much of his career, despite being a slave owner, kind of in the mold that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington do. He sees a gradual emancipation as being the way to go, not in favor of immediate emancipation, but more in favor that it should be gradually. And he's also a proponent for colonization throughout his career. But in addition to that, something he's passionate about for most of his career is what gets referred to as the American system. He's very much a believer that the country needs to grow and grow together. And a key way to do that is through internal improvements. So it's kind of his signature economic plan to improve roads, to get canals, to really bind the country together and help with the infrastructure that then can support American industry and economically grow as a nation. And that's really his key economic plan that he pushes when he starts off as a national Republican and then into the Whig Party, which he's really a leading member of, which forms in opposition to Andrew Jackson.
So you're talking a little bit about the infrastructure projects that he was supporting here in our area. Being in Harpers Ferry, around this time, we're seeing the race of the canal and the railroad, and also the great national road is not so far away. Are these projects that he would have been involved in or just generally in favor of? Can you speak on that at all?
Yeah, when he first starts going to Washington, D.C. from Lexington, it takes him 3 weeks. And that's just another example to him that this is a ridiculously long trip that he has to take. And it shortens up about half that length when he starts going on, partly because of the national road and some of the canals that make it easier. And eventually railroads will continue to make that trip a little smoother. But it just goes further into his plan that interstate commerce, a national bank, ways in which to boost the economies, the nation's economy is really a key thing if the country is going to continue to grow and prosper. So he's very much an advocate of that throughout his time.
Nice. What are some of the other challenges that he faced during his career while he's in Washington? It seems like he was kind of in the middle of so much of our antebellum conversation. In terms of, he's known as this man of compromises in trying to prevent sectionalism and civil war. And can you give us any information about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And during this period, particularly between the Revolution and the Civil War, so often sometimes glossed over. But when you look at who the presidents were in that time and some of the icons in Congress, you see that great compromiser label that he gets as a huge accomplishment. It ultimately, ironically, probably hurts his chances to ever win the presidency. But at the time, when people needed something done, they looked to Henry Clay. And he was someone that very much was willing to work beyond party affiliations to get things done. And for him, it starts off early on in his career. In 1820, with the Missouri Compromise, of course, that's what really puts his name on the map on a national scale, working for months to try to put multiple compromises together to settle this massive issue, which was really the first time that slavery was being grappled with since the Constitution. And you had a state in Missouri that was looking, or a territory of Missouri that wanted to become a state. And this really then put pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery forces against one another. And it was very controversial about what to do with all this new territory that was west of the Mississippi River, when inevitably it's going to want to become a state. So that's what really gets him on the map. But he's certainly not one who is avoiding controversies either. Just a few years after that, he is a central figure in what's known as the corrupt bargain. And it's another thing that puts him on the map, but it also sets a lifelong feud between him and Andrew Jackson. As you would think, Clay and Jackson would probably get along. They're both Southerners. They both went out west at an early age. They're slaveholders, plantation owners. But these two hate each other throughout their entire lives. I mean, on Andrew Jackson's deathbed, he probably wishes he could have been the one who eventually would be the reason Henry Clay dies. I mean, he just despises him. And part of that originates in 1824, when in the election, there's 4 main candidates for the presidency. And Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote. Clay also was up for it, but he comes in 4th. And by congressional rules, the election went to the House of Representatives. And it went to the 3 candidates who got the most votes. And that was Andrew Jackson, then John Quincy Adams, and then William Crawford. Where Clay comes in this, though, he's also the Speaker of the House. And he had worked to really bring a lot of power to the Speaker position. And that gave him a pretty huge chip where he could really decide who becomes president. And he never liked Jackson for a lot of reasons. He did have respect for John Quincy Adams. So he threw his support and his support down to John Quincy Adams to become president, despite not being the popular vote winner. And not long after that, John Quincy Adams names Henry Clay Secretary of State, a position that Clay had sought up to that point in his career. And for Jackson, he uses this really to attack Henry Clay, calling it this corrupt bargain that they made against him. And it's something that Clay really has to fight for the rest of his career, even though he'll go on to a lot of decades of success. This corrupt bargain, the supposed corrupt bargain, really haunted him politically for a while.
So bringing up the figure of Andrew Jackson is interesting, because I know that today a lot of people criticize many of his policies across the board. Did Clay ever clash with Jackson over some of these big things, like the Indian Removal Act or other items, the bank?
Yeah, they clashed over basically anything you could clash over. Personally, they did not like each other. Politically, Henry Clay is the leader of an opposition party that formed specifically because of Andrew Jackson.
Wow.
Clay always was skeptical of Jackson. He doesn't trust political people who get to that position because of military success. And he just views Jackson as someone who won a battle during the War of 1812. He doesn't respect what he had done with Indians in Spain, and also some liabilities and liberties he took with that. He doesn't like Jackson's stance on Indian removal. They especially clash over the national bank. And that is something that Jackson fights against immediately, that he distrusts banks. And what he wants to do is basically destroy the national bank, which Henry Clay sees as central for being able to give people loans as a part of that American system. So it actually comes to a head in the 1820s between the two, where as a kind of a political ploy, Henry Clay helped with Nicholas Biddle to get the charter started early. And it actually becomes a huge political issue that Jackson ultimately triumphs on, where Jackson portrays the bank as really just for the upper class kind of people and further hurts the common man. So it's a battle that those two will always fight, and Jackson will always hold that grudge against Henry Clay, in addition to the fact that they personally don't care for each other either.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
I will say too, they run against each other for office.
Yes.
Which of course further complicates it in 1832, where Clay thinks he's got chances. He was terrified of Andrew Jackson having a second term as president. He looks back in hindsight thinking that he didn't have a chance in 1832, and he's right, but at the time he definitely thought he could beat Jackson.
So for those of us who have just discovered Andrew Jackson and might be upset with him, Henry and Clay sounds like a figure to investigate further.
Yeah, don't like Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay is definitely a politician for you.
Yes. All right. So Henry Clay, another one of his roles in Washington, he's actually Secretary of State for a while. Can you tell us anything about his experience as Secretary of State? Because that seems like a pretty major position.
It was, and it was a position he wanted for a while. And the reason for that, it was Secretary of State was really the launching pad to become president. It was almost like the training ground. If you're Secretary of State, it's positioning you for then the next level of office. So it's a position that he had wanted through the early 1800s. And then when he actually gets it in 1824, again, it's kind of tainted by the supposed corrupt bargain that the Democrats hammer him on. He only serves one term as Secretary of State, but really for him, he's getting ready then for fighting Andrew Jackson eventually in 1828, when he, of course, doesn't endorse him for the presidency. And then ultimately, he serves just one term as Secretary of State. So it's only a small part of his career, but it's a very significant position that he holds, but one that also helps better position him for further compromises that he's going to have to make. And you mentioned 1830, I think, for the Mint Julep.
Yeah.
That's really right in the height of him getting ready to try to oppose Andrew Jackson in 1832. It's also at the height of him finishing off another compromise, partly because of Andrew Jackson and another person who goes back and forth in terms between love and hate with John Calhoun. So there's a lot of big personalities, and there's a lot of kind of bickering between kind of several key figures at various points, but also brings the country to the brink of possible dissolution again, this time over the idea of tariffs.
All right, let me see if we have any, let's see here, let me check on questions for a moment.
Yeah, that's really right.
All right. So Henry Clay is also involved in one of the last major compromises in 1850, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and again, there's a series of compromises. I mean, he really gets, again, it came in 1820 with two different compromises with Missouri, and then again in 1833 over the tariff. But he retires multiple times from being a senator, being a congressman. But he, in his latter part of his life, once again goes back to Congress. And in 1850, there's another issue, kind of to put this all to a head, regarding multiple things that eventually come with the federal fugitive slave law, what happens with California, another dividing line with the border of Texas. So there's a few different issues that play, once again, bringing the slavery issue into a national debate. And for Henry Clay, he's someone who's already got the view as a great compromiser and has already reached iconic levels in terms of how the public views him. So he gets a lot of credit for the Compromise of 1850 and passionately advocating for this omnibus bill to pass these 5 pieces of legislation as part of the compromise. But really, though, it's Stephen Douglas who really at this point is doing a lot of the heavy lifting to get the votes to get this passed. It's got Henry Clay's support. It's got Daniel Webster's support, another iconic congressman at the time. Not really John Calhoun's support, of course, for this one. But he's kind of the figurehead for this last act that he'll do politically before once again retiring to Kentucky, and he ultimately dies in 1852, not long after those bills get passed. He dies of tuberculosis. So it's kind of the last key piece of legislation that he's a part of and is really the figurehead for it.
Okay. If you could identify, and this is somebody who is involved in so many big things that are happening at the time. If you could identify maybe his top 1 or 2 contributions, what would they be in your opinion?
Yeah, so he's someone, again, if you're going to look at who really might be the most iconic congressman in U.S. history, or politician really in general, even including presidents, I mean, it's hard not to include Henry Clay in this. He is a man that is worthy of the reputation as a great compromiser. He multiple times, while the country is grappling with this central issue of what to do with slavery, he is someone who is able to bind a very sectional country. It's not just North and South either, it's North, South, and West. And for him, he is able to really patch pieces together to keep this going. And part of that is because of just his personality. He's always known for being someone, if he's speaking, you go and listen to see what he has to say. He was an electric speaker and someone that could really throw a lot of weight behind what he believed in because of that charisma. He's also someone who really garners the affection of all people, not just voters. He's hugely popular with women in the United States. He's known as a ladies' man who also very much likes that attention. He's someone who, again, whether you're a voter or not, he very much comes ingrained in American culture, not just what's going on throughout Congress. And that's why when he travels throughout the country, people hold dinners for him. And he embraces that. He loves partying. There's no surprise to me that he brings the Mint Julep to the Willard Hotel. He was a big drinker. I know he liked wine also, but he's a gambler as well. Very well known in his early life for on a nightly basis, drinking and gambling. But he continues this idea of always having parties, always taking part in these things, even when he's in Washington, D.C., and brings a very social element to it. But he's also someone who, again, is the leader of an entire political party. He does become the figurehead of the Whig Party, which forms in opposition to a very disastrous president that they saw in Andrew Jackson. And it's no surprise that the Whig Party collapses not long after Henry Clay dies. So both from a personal element, a fascinating life, to the political one where it's hard to say someone else had a bigger impact on American politics than Henry Clay.
That's a pretty powerful recommendation for him. Thank you. We did have a couple questions come in. Here's one. What was Clay's stance on the Texas War for Independence and the war with Mexico? Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's one that Henry Clay is personally involved in too. His stance on war in general changes throughout his career. He actually is a proponent for the War of 1812 initially, for example. Like a lot of Westerners, he saw this as a way to kind of open up more territory in the West in the War of 1812. But by the conclusion of it, he's over in Europe and he helps sign the treaty to end that war. And I think that has a large role to play in how he then views the situation with Mexico. He's very personally against the Mexican War, not seeing that it being worth going to war for to potentially bring Mexico into the United States. He gets more vocal speaking out against it as the war goes on, though. But it's a personal thing for him, too, as his, I hate to call one of his children his favorite, but Henry Clay Jr. is probably, his closest sibling. And Henry Clay Jr. fought in the Mexican War. Henry Clay gave him this kind of iconic pistol that he takes with him. And Henry Clay Jr. dies at, I think, the Battle of Buena Vista. So he never makes it back from the Mexican War. And this is something that Henry Clay holds, in mourning for the rest of his life. And that pistol was returned to him at a very tragic moment in his life, full of a lot of, unfortunately, tragic deaths for some of his children. But he is not an advocate for the Mexican War. In terms of Texas independence before that, I don't know particularly what he says on Texas independence, but he is then very strongly in the camp that it's not something the United States should go to war for to continue to preserve Texas independence and likely bring into the country.
Thank you. We had another comment talking about how Abraham Lincoln considered himself to be a Clay Whig. Would you consider that to be an accurate statement of Lincoln's attitude toward Clay?
Absolutely. And Henry Clay is really something that Lincoln looks up to politically. They both start off as lawyers. He really views this as kind of what an ideal statesman can be. He has a lot of similarities to Henry Clay on the issue of slavery and really views him as the ideal statesman. It's also politically shrewd for Abraham Lincoln to do so as well. Lincoln is a Whig. He is against the Mexican War, just like Henry Clay is. But then when it becomes the sectional Republican Party, one way to help show that it's not as radical as the Democrats are portraying them to be is to show his connections to Henry Clay. So Lincoln often brings up Henry Clay in several of his speeches as he's running against Douglas in the 1850s and into the 1860s as well. Lincoln really looks to Henry Clay for guidance and for political opportunity too, to show that he is much more of a, in some ways, conservative type figure, not the radical Republican that they're being painted as by Democrats in the lead up to 1860.
Interesting, thank you. Let's see, another question. Are there any other famous allies of Henry Clay, such as Lincoln?
Yeah, well, when you have a career that spans decades in Congress, at various points you're going to have allies and you're going to have enemies, and at various points it probably oscillates between those. Unlike Jackson, who there is no goodwill really between these two forever. For the most part, Henry Clay gets along and agrees with a lot of things with John Quincy Adams, who was the president when Clay was Secretary of State. But really the two other figures that most prominently get associated with Henry Clay are John Calhoun and Daniel Webster. And those three at the time become known as the Great Triumvirate because of the iconic stature that the three hold, the power that they hold, and the fact that they do represent the three main sections of the country, with Daniel Webster being from the Northeast, John Calhoun, a South Carolinian, and then Henry Clay representing the West in Kentucky. And at various points, it's 2 versus 1. Sometimes it's Henry Clay and Daniel Webster allied together against Calhoun. Sometimes it's Clay and Calhoun against Webster. So it really depends on the issue, but those three are forever linked together. It's almost like a singular body, and they have a lot of similarities. They're three men who are beloved by a lot of people throughout the country. They also are three people who have a lot of political baggage. And that's another reason why neither of those three ever become president. When you have that much baggage, it means you have that many enemies and that many issues that people can bring up in a presidential election that doesn't really make you viable, especially in a period where there's weak presidents for that purpose, is that you really can't pick someone who's got a big track record in this antebellum period. Another reason why these three are so much more powerful than typically how you view congressmen today.
Thank you. To sort of wrap this up here, what do you think are the great lessons of Henry Clay that we can take forward with us today? Is there anything that we can take forward with us today from Mr. Clay other than his drink?
Yeah, there's so many, but like one of his famous lines was, "I'd rather be right than president." I mean, that plays well too. But at the time, I mean, he very much is not someone who is going to stand by a position, and even if he disagrees with it down the road, stay with it. I mean, some people call that a flip-flopper, but for him, he evolves on issues. He's someone that is not defined by party politics, partly just because of the era that he grows up in, not really having a defined two-party system, but really throughout his entire life, someone who does truly look beyond party in a lot of ways. And you can't dismiss the mint julep on American society too. I mean, his personal life is really just as interesting in a lot of ways as his professional life. He loves horse racing. He helps make it more of a proper gentleman's sport to be a part of. He breeds horses at the time. He's known for his charismatic personality and kind of infectious personality. He's just a fascinating figure in so many aspects of it.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're going to conclude our program here. If you like this blend of brain food and liquid entertainment, both Joe and myself are involved in programs normally where you can come and see us and hear some history and enjoy a drink. Joe participates with a program called History on Tap, which I believe you're doing now online Thursdays at 7, correct?
We are, yeah. Different topics every week, but we're always Thursday at 7, live streaming so we can take people's questions just like you've been doing tonight. Yeah, so we've got a list coming up that you can see what we've got coming up for the month of May. Excellent.
And then I also do these vintage cocktail workshops from time to time through the Harpers Ferry Park Association as fundraisers. And we actually teach you how to make different drinks and tell you some of the legends behind them. I don't normally get an opportunity to go into so much detail. So thank you, Joe, for coming and chatting with us about Henry Clay.
Absolutely, I'm happy to.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Joe. Anything else you want to say before we go?
No, but yeah, you mentioned it's Derby weekend. It's disappointing. The Derby has not been disrupted since it really started in the 1870s or so. So it's disappointing now, but I believe they're trying to do it in September. So hopefully it gives us another reason then to break out the mint julep recipe.
Yes, absolutely. All right. And I will post the recipe and directions again underneath this video so everyone can have them if you want to come back and look at it later. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great night.